His Rwandan counterpart Paul Kagame called for a ceasefire in eastern Congo on Tuesday during their first meeting since M23 rebels stepped up an offensive there in January. A joint statement issued along with Qatar, whose emir mediated the sit-down in Doha, said the ceasefire should be immediate and unconditional. It was, however, unclear whether that would stop the M23 insurgents, who are now in control of more territory than ever before in eastern Congo, including the region's two biggest cities. What happens next? Well, this is what we want to interrogate. With me is Stella Gara, a governance and security analyst. Good evening, Stella. Always a pleasure to have you.
Good evening, and thank you for having me.
So let's just... A lot has happened between Monday and Tuesday. So let's start with Monday. The EU Council decided to impose sanctions on Rwandan military and government following a successful push by Belgium over DRC. Then all of a sudden, Rwanda, which is being accused of fueling the DRC conflict, respond by severing ties with Belgium. Then Belgium do the same, and they give each of their diplomats 48 hours to leave both countries. Then Tuesday, a day later, or should it be an hours later, we have the president of DRC, President Rwanda, meeting Emir of Qatar, that is Sheikh Tamim bin Hamad Al Thani, in Doha. And all of a sudden, an immediate and unconditional ceasefire has been agreed. Let's not forget that on Monday, the M23 rebels, who had taken control of course of Bukavu and Goma, were supposed to be having talks with DRC. They pulled out of those talks, and now it seems like everything is all over the place. From where you sit, what is happening?
You know, Ash, this is quite a playback of the scramble and partition for Africa. A lot of the moves that have been made around the conflict around DRC have got to do with resources. And so every moving part has, in fact, every moving part you see has an interest in the resources in DRC. Rest assured, none of those people have an interest in peace, most likely apart from the president of DRC and most likely the president of Rwanda. He would have preferred to continue benefiting from what he was getting out of DRC without conflict, or at least with some quiet, you know. But any other force coming from outside, talk of the government of Belgium and their interests in DRC, talk of the EU itself, all those governments are coming in because of interests. That is one. Number two, when it comes to DRC, Belgium is not innocent. Some of DRC's troubles, actually not some of, practically all of DRC's troubles started with King Leopold, thinking that he can decide that he likes a certain portion of Africa and therefore declare that he wants that to be his portion. And it was his backyard for a very long time while he was living in Belgium. And so come a time like this, you don't even expect to find their hand in the pie. When you find their hand in the pie, you know there's a problem. Now, once you notice that there are cracks developing, you then know that there are certain terms of agreements that have not been met at this point, which is why you'll find the Republic of Rwanda wanting to sever ties with the Republic, with Belgium and vice versa. There are consequences to those ties being severed, but personally I would want to approach this conversation without those outside forces in mind. Unfortunately, we cannot afford to ignore one outside force that is a new entrant.
Qatar.
Qatar shows up out of nowhere with very convincing power. For some strange reason, they have managed to summon these two gentlemen into the same room. The different talks that were supposed to be held in this continent, one that was supposed to be led by the chair of the EAC, which is also Kenya, and therefore the president of Kenya, fell through the cracks because of mistakes from our end. The conversations that were supposed to be happening in Luanda, in Angola, also fell through the cracks. On Monday, as you have mentioned, the M23 rebels pulled out of the talks. And of course, they pulled out of the talks because they got wind of what was just about to happen. So there are many interests coming in. I'm yet to figure out how Qatar fits into the entire puzzle. But there are very many interests coming in. And I realize now that a lot of the nations that do not have the resources that DRC has are coming in to what's the word? Like hawks, to collect what they can collect now that there's a conflict existent. As a matter of fact, if this conflict is not very well managed, you'll find that at the end of it, newcomers will have come in because DRC is wealthy. DRC is wealthy to the point that its neighbors have been very jealous of it to the point of going in to even steal.
You're just eyeing it.
You know, not just eyeing, going in and collecting and selling product from DRC as if it is from their nations. Some of them being members of the East Africa community. Unfortunately, that puts quite a strain in the relationships within the East Africa community. That is why we have a conflict that by the EAC policies, by the EAC structures, are supposed to be resolved internally. There are decision-making mechanisms that can be used to address this situation. But they fail to address it because even they have been found with their hands in the pie. So a lot is happening, I can tell you. Most of these realignments have to do with issues about the fourth industrial revolution, technology, and the fact that many people are trying to get the resources they need to control AI. Don't ever assume that China is not in this math. China has actually tried to create technology that can work with less resources needed from DRC. And of course, as they are creating those, they're still looking for the advantage that they need to get from DRC.
Yeah.
So everyone is scrambling for those resources that are rare on Earth and can only be found either in DRC or very little amounts in other jurisdictions. Not just the EAC should be worried. The entire continent of Africa should be extremely worried because DRC, number one, is the heart of Africa. If that nation itself does not have proper peace, this continent is never going to be at rest. I know you are aware that some of the aquifers that we have that can supply most of the continent with clean water are domiciled in DRC.
Yes.
And of course, we also found one here in Kenya, but majority of that clean water can only be found in DRC. In terms of even carbon absorption and the forest cover in DRC, it's one of those countries that has very rich forest cover, a lot of virgin land that has not been used for industrialization like the rest of this continent has. So we must be concerned if DRC is not safe. Now, if DRC, with all its wealth, has been robbed to the point that the nation struggles to find money to hold an election, then we should ask ourselves, how about those nations that do not have resources? How about even that neighbor in Rwanda that is currently fighting DRC for resources? What if somebody comes to decide to do the same thing to a nation that does not have resources? They care about destroying DRC because there's something they must protect even as they're fighting the forces to get resources from DRC.
Yeah.
But when they come to you and you have nothing to offer, they will destroy your entire nation.
But then what happens to the, notion of African problems need African solutions? Because at this rate, Qatar came out of nowhere. And it's left so many people wondering if both presidents didn't come for the EAC, and then the Luanda-led peace process. So they keep on saying, yes, we'll continue the Nairobi and Luanda peace process. But why continue the discussion in Qatar or in Doha?
Two things come to mind. There's a phrase that is taught a lot in schools in Kenya, but for some strange reason, it's not taught alongside the conversations on history and how we should govern our continent. It's taught as part of literature, and they call it ukoloni mamboleo, which is like neo-colonialism.
Yeah.
Okay? There are elements in our society who never got over the loot they got from colonization. And so these groups of people have always lived in a way that they continue negotiating their nations into the hands of their colonizer. We've seen the situation, for example, that was in Gabon, that they practically have a coup. We have their president desperate asking us to make noise. We assume that there's a change happening in that nation, and then all of a sudden, the person who takes over is his cousin. It's his cousin who is going to continue collaborating with their oppressor in running the nation. A few years in, when they're now supposed to be having an election, the gentleman who was supposed to be holding power until the next election insists he's going to be vying. We have people who got infected with the disease of colonization. They benefited from colonization and have decided they're not going to let go of that tap. And then we have a good portion of our population that is still operating with a lot of goodwill, because Africans are always those good people who will share, who like having resources for everyone to benefit from, and they're still assuming that the people they elect have goodwill. Africa must bring itself to a place where we are going to begin electing leaders based on our interests, that we will not just be vetting leaders based on tribe, we will not just be vetting leaders based on the promises they make in their manifesto, but we will be checking their track record. What does an individual own? Who do they relate with? Who is funding their campaign? One of the problems you will find in DRC is because one of the forces controlling DRC is a force that also funded the presidency of DRC. You will find that some of the forces supporting Rwanda currently in this conflict are forces that want to get a cut of what the forces that supported the president of DRC are getting now from DRC. You will notice that even when defending your own people, for example, when South Africa wanted to come in and defend their people, when they're telling Rwanda they will treat the attack on their barrack as an act of war, they had to seek permission from foreign governments outside the continent. Why are they seeking permission? Because there are certain installations that they cannot hit when they're in the middle of retaliation, for example. We have brought ourselves to such a bad situation that every time we need to talk about ourselves, we look outside. And why that is happening is because we have had leaders over a very long time who refuse to think for the continent. So the second problem is that where we get leaders who want to think for the continent, they get assassinated by the same oppressors. So if you look at countries like Burkina Faso, this seed that is currently leading Burkina Faso in the name of Ibrahim Traore is not a new seed. Burkina Faso has had several of those leaders who come in and say they want to change their nation, and as soon as they say that, they get assassinated. You will find those stories all the way down sub-Saharan Africa of leaders who came up, wanted to change their countries, and as soon as it was established that their interest is internal and not outward-looking, they were assassinated. It's not a problem that is unique to Africa. I mean, the world must take care of its interests. Currently, there are people, many people, who have turned lasers on the head of the President of the United States of America because he's making policies that are taking resources out of the pockets of certain individuals, moving them into the pockets of other individuals. It's a question of capitalism. It's a question of poor leadership and governance. And it's also a question of extreme selfishness amongst Africans, number one, and number two, accepting to be divided along tribal lines that did not exist before the colonizer came. The scramble and partition of Africa that I started with in this conversation caused certain divisions in our continent that don't necessarily need to be there. That is why you have Luyas in Uganda speaking to Luyas in Kenya in Busia, but they assume that they belong to different countries and they're one people. That is why you have Tutsis in Goma, and then you have Tutsis on the other side of Rwanda, and they assume they're different countries and even fight each other just because they are across a border, an imaginary border that was created by an individual who did not even belong in this space. We always had resource conflicts. We always had resource conflicts. But the only reason why people should have resource conflicts is if they have not gone to school and if they have not learned how to divide resources carefully. And if you don't have sufficient resources in one area, Ash, the idea is to look for where more resources can be found, sell to each other, or share with each other, or do a trade, so that everybody then gets enough of what they are missing. Which is, as a continent, we have refused to have those conversations internally to say, I need this from Uganda, I need this from Libya, I need this from Equatorial Guinea. Instead, we're having those conversations with the external forces that continue to divide us outside our continent. They sell to us, we give them some of our products cheaply, and unfortunately, when the time comes, the person you need to be your neighbor to defend you will not defend you because they have to defend the interests of the external person you are speaking to.
Sadly, that's the same thing that's happening in Sudan. But before we even get to Sudan, do you think the M23 rebels will now give up that territory that they have acquired between January and now? I mean, Bukavu, Goma, big cities.
They will not give up that territory easily. They'll have to be fought for it. Power does not like a vacuum. When the M23 took over Goma, that is the point where the government of the DRC and the military of the DRC should have secured places like Bukavu. And it's not just Bukavu, but the entire Kivu region, because if you study the history of DRC and if you study the geography of DRC, you'll discover that North Kivu region is very rich in all the resources that we're talking about. Call it coltan, cobalt, titanium, gold, you know. There's plenty of all that in that particular region, and it's so concentrated in that very space. So when you're at war, some of the things you do is to protect your installations. For countries that don't have much, they will be protecting their airports, etc., and hospitals, etc. But when you have those kinds of resources, your mines are part of the things that you're supposed to be protecting. And so because M23 has already taken over Goma and Bukavu, as a matter of fact, I have a feeling that they may try to use this lull to try and get another jurisdiction before the real war starts. Their funders are in shock right now because I don't think any of them had anticipated that there was going to be a meeting in Qatar. And so who knows, they may actually inject more resources to prevent the entrance of Qatar, and it may mean that it's an escalation of the conflict.
So this is far from over.
This is very far from over. The problems in DRC have been going on for so long. The looting by neighboring countries has been going on for so long. The interests of USA, Belgium, Russia, the United Kingdom in DRC are as old. As a matter of fact, every millennial who has existed has never heard of peace in DRC.
That's actually true. But anyway, let's just talk about Sudan and South Sudan. I mean, Sudan's situation seems to be worsening, and it's sort of trickling down to South Sudan, which is now the brink of civil war, which will take us back where we were before. What is the region doing about it?
Ash, I wish we had a whole day so that I could give you a continuum of how these conflicts are developing. And then you'd realize that the short story I've told about Gabon and Bongo is similar to the story of Sudan. A nation is fed up of a dictator. They fight to remove the dictator, and in 2011 they succeed in getting rid of the dictator. You succeed in getting rid of your dictator, and then you now start negotiating who's going to take over after this dictator has been removed. And then as a country, you see forces coming together, just like what is happening in Kenya right now. You see forces coming in together, talking, speaking to each other, and agreeing that this is what you're going to do. What happened is that this entity that was rather hosted in Kenya recently, RSF, was created as a force, as a movement to protect the dictator Omar al-Bashir at the time when he was in power. At the time when they were protecting him, he did not see how this militia could eventually turn around against him. When the coup happened, they joined the coup and removed him from office. So, of course, the transitional citizens movement and the RSF sat together to agree who was going to get into power. As soon as they got someone, got a temporary government to help with the transition, they found ways to split again. RSF went separately, and now they're fighting with the Sudan forces. Here's the thing. When a revolution comes too early, and this is something that the whole of this continent should be very careful about, especially because most of our revolutions are funded from outside the continent. When people are calling for a revolution, take some time to breathe and investigate who is funding every tongue. Forget about those who get into the conversation just so that they can be able to show the world. No, rather show people that they're capable of speaking so that they're selected to represent a party like Casmol, for example. Look at the people with deep pockets who can mobilize several of you and put you in one place. Who is funding them? Who's mobilizing those people? If they're mobilizing those people, what are they saying? Do they have somebody else that they want to plant into power when you remove the person who's in power? Because it's very easy to remove yourself out of the frying pan and into the fire. Sudan is a very wealthy nation. South Sudan is a very wealthy nation. The conflict between them split them, but even as they split, they all went away with a lot of wealth in terms of minerals and etc. and gems. However, most of the technology went with Sudan. So Sudan should not be listed among some of the poor nations because they have the resources to develop the nation, but they have found themselves at a place where there's a vacuum of leadership.
But critics are saying this, whatever is happening in Sudan, could lead it to perhaps another division.
It's very easy for that to happen when a nation has gotten, not a nation, when a people have gotten used to conflict for a very long time, they don't know the difference. I don't know whether you have interacted with some of the citizens of these two nations that you're talking about, South Sudan and Sudan. Yeah. We mostly have Somalis and South Sudanese here. You will notice that every time you're around them, you want to sit back and just watch them and confirm if they're not fighting. Because they're not used to peaceful conversations. They're not used to getting things easily. Everything for them has been a hassle for a very long time. They don't know how to act differently. And so right now, in their minds, because they separated from South Sudan and got a certain level of peace that they were thinking of, or managed to separate themselves, they may still assume that they need to split South Sudan into other portions so that they can be able to continue enjoying resources. But the reason why that will happen is because the leadership of the RSF is a very greedy leadership. And of course, the Sudan forces are trying to make sure that they keep their country together.
So Kenya finds itself in the middle of all this. How should we navigate this diplomatically?
I think the first thing is that the president's handlers, as far as foreign affairs and international relations is concerned, need to either be recalled or their loyalty checked. I do not know why, for example, they allowed the president to make a speech where he declared that in addressing the situation in the Democratic Republic of Congo, he spoke to the president of France. I don't understand why anybody would make that kind of a rookie mistake. Knowing the history of DRC and knowing the history of French colonies, that is not something that should have been allowed to happen.
Okay.
Number two, he is currently, because he's the president of Kenya, chairing the EAC. The failure of peace processes in the region currently are reflecting very badly on him. Why? There have been conflicts in DRC. There have been conflicts in Burundi, in Rwanda, under other presidents of other nations as they were chairing the heads of state summit in the EAC. Why now are we not able to even come in and resolve the issues that we are dealing with? Kenya, for a very long time, was a friend of our neighbors. Our former president, His Excellency, the late President Moi, may not have been a good president for Kenya, may not have done much for Kenya, but in terms of friendship with the region, he maintained very good relations, and Kenya was constantly called to negotiate peace for our region. The people working for the president and doing international relations and foreign relations should ensure that they bring him back to good books. When it comes to outside affairs, it doesn't matter whether we want him to be in power or not. It just matters that our status out there is actually respectable, that when our voice comes in, our neighbors trust us to protect them. Because one of the issues that is going to arise from this is that the day we are in trouble, and we don't look like we are far from trouble, the day we are in trouble, none of them is going to come to our help. So we must work very hard to reinstate those relationships, to reinstate trust in those relationships, and number three, and most important, to ensure that in all this madness that is happening in the East Africa community, we don't have an implosion. The Secretary General currently at the EAC is a Kenyan, a lady. We are currently leading the political affairs, and we must make sure that we keep the continent, the region close to each other, because this EAC region is an example and the best format for regional organization in the entire continent. I'm
sure this is a conversation that is not ending today. Stella Gara, governance and security analyst. That's all we had for you here on News Hour. I'm Ashley Mazuri. Up next is Manspective Africa. Good night.